Yeah, what's up, Duck?
Korg Monologue Analog Synth. Part 1 is going to be an overview of this synth. It's pretty simple but has some great features which can make some complex and interesting sounds. I'll also cover briefly some principles of subtractive synthesis. Subtractive synthesis. Subtractive synthesis. Subtractive synthesis. Why is that so difficult to say? I don't know. Part 2, I'm going to try and recreate the sound of an orchestra. Part 2, I'm going to try and recreate the sound of an orchestra with this thing. Typically monosynths are like a go-to for bass sounds and leads, and you would use a polysynth to create chords, big pads, strings, etc. But with the modern day of the DAW, you have infinite tracks to record and layer things up. If you think, for an example, the string section in an orchestra, each violin, viola, cello and bass is typically only playing a single note. Add it all together and you get rich chords and harmonies. So, the Korg Monologue has been around for a while now. Many people call it a beginner synth, but I'd frame it more like this. It has a simple feature set which is well thought out, and there is less options to get in the way of your creativity, getting you to some of the interesting sounds faster. The inspiration is in its limitations. I kind of reckon that any synth or instrument has its own soul, if you will. The way everything is laid out, how it sounds, feels, and even smells may inspire you to approach things a little differently. You know, see things from a different angle, create new and interesting results. Of course, certain instruments do certain things well and become a go-to tool in your workflow. But from time to time, it's good to disrupt all that and break away from what can end up being, you know, your usual thing. So, yeah, true sign that this is a genuine analog machine is that when you switch it on, it tunes itself, because real analog stuff doesn't stay in tune. The Korg Monologue is a monophonic synth, meaning one note can be played at a time. It has all the basics for subtractive synthesis.
Not for a succotash.
2 oscillators that can be mixed, 1 low-pass filter, 1 envelope, 1 LFO, and a 16-note step sequencer. There are also 80 preset patches and 20 user programmable. It features an analog signal path, making it a true analog monosynth. For connectivity, it has MIDI in and out on standard MIDI connections, USB, which you can also use for MIDI and loading, downloading patches, firmware, software, etc. It also has sync in and out, which sends and receives clock pulses to the sequencer section. There is also audio output, as you'd expect, headphones, and an audio in. More on that later. The Monologue can be powered by 9 volts DC adapter or 6 AA batteries. Another nice touch is this little OLED display, which, apart from displaying the various menus and parameters and parameter values, it also acts as like a little oscilloscope. So, what is subtractive synthesis? The analogy is like, you know, starting with a block of wood, carving bits away till you end up with like a new shape or form. In a synth, you start with a waveform generated by an oscillator or oscillators. You then have a set of tools for removing bits of the frequency spectrum or its amplitude to shape it into something that, for an example, sounds like a piano, or, you know, an approximation of that, or a flute, or something totally unique. Right, starting on the left-hand side, there is a master volume. Below it is a drive control which adds overdrive, distortion to the output for more aggressive, harmonically rich sounding sounds. VCO1, or voltage controlled oscillator, has 3 selectable waveforms: saw, triangle and square. Triangle waves are almost a pure fundamental frequency without any harmonics above or below it, whereas a saw or a square adds harmonics above or below the fundamental frequency. There's also a shape control, which is basically pulse width and can act on all 3 waveforms. I can demonstrate this by showing what happens on the oscilloscope. Essentially, we are skewing the symmetry of the waveform, which creates different tonal possibilities. VCO2 has saw and triangle, but instead of a square wave, has noise. There is also the same shape control. In addition, there's an octave range switch, pitch control, sync and ring modes. This means that VCO2 can also play in different octaves to VCO1, or you can tune it to create intervals, or just slightly detune it for that kind of detuned sound. Sync mode means that the phase of VCO2 is synchronized, it's like hard synchronized to VCO1, creating some harmonic overtones where there's kind of sort of a strange overlap in the shapes. Ring modulates VCO2's waveform to the output of VCO1, resulting in some metallic sounds. This is also the fundamental principles of FM synthesis. I'm not sure why I went kind of William Hague there. This is also the fundamental principle of FM synthesis. We can also tune oscillator 2 to a different pitch to create an interval. Next we have a mixer section, which is simply level controls for both VCO. Then the filter, which is a low pass resonant filter and sounds sort of like a Korg MS style filter. The cutoff control sets a threshold where frequencies above it are cut off, and resonance adds emphasis to the area of frequencies just before that cutoff point. The envelope generator, or EG, has three controls: attack, decay and intensity. It has three modes and can be routed to the VCO's pitch, or just VCO2's pitch, or the filter cutoff. Attack and decay define a time period for the rise and fall of a level, whereas intensity adjusts how much of an effect that level change will have. Apart from in one mode, the EG is always connected to the VCA, which controls the amplitude of a sound. So when we press a key, the attack will control how quickly that sound gets loud, and decay is the opposite of that, controlling how quickly the sound then gets quiet. As mentioned earlier, the EG can also be routed to the filter to open and close that over time, or to the VCO to create a rise and a fall in pitch. If we select Attack, Gate, Decay mode, here the decay control won't come into effect until the key is released. Then we have Gate mode, which doesn't route the EG to the VCA at all, so it will just affect the cutoff or the pitch or whatever. The LFO, or low frequency oscillator, can be routed to the VCO's pitch for vibrato. The VCO shape for pulse width modulation. Or filter cutoff for a sort of wah-wah or tremolo effect. It can produce saw, triangle and square waves, has controls for rate or speed, and then also an intensity control. LFOs don't usually go into audible frequency range and are usually used as a modulation source. However, this one has a fast mode which does go into the range of human hearing and can create some interesting sounds when, for example, applied to the cutoff. So we've got one-shot mode here, which stops the LFO after half a cycle on a key press. So this can be used as a sort of second envelope generator. One-shot mode. The LFO can also be tempo matched to a BPM, for example when using the sequencer. Holding shift whilst adjusting the intensity control moves everything in a negative direction. Other controls to note, there is a pitch bender, an octave switch to select the range of the keyboard, a tempo knob to adjust the sequencer's speed, and a rotary encoder to select patches and enter other parameters. There is also some buttons here for programming the sequencer and accessing system menus. So here I've got there's a bit of footage from an earlier video, and it just demonstrates the audio in capability on the Korg Monologue. What it allows you to do is to inject a signal into its signal path after the VCOs. And here all I've done is I've turned the VCO volumes down on the mixer, so all you're hearing is the audio in. I've also got a MIDI connection going from the DX7 to the Korg Monologue, and all that's doing is sending a trigger to trigger the envelope generator or the LFO, and I've got, in this instance, the LFO patched into the filter, and so every time I press a key on the Yamaha DX7, it's setting the LFO off and opening the filter up, and also telling the Korg Monologue to pass the signal through from the audio in. And yeah, that just allows me to essentially add a filter and another envelope generator onto the DX7, which is kind of cool. The sequencer has 16 steps to it, or you can think of it as dividing a bar into 16th notes, and it has 3 layers to it. Tempo. Play button. On the first layer, it's for programming notes, which can be recorded in real time or programmed in steps. There are also buttons for adding rests or tying notes together to get a longer note value. On the second layer, this adds a slide function so you can program a portamento or pitch bend between notes. Slide. Third layer, this allows you to record up to 4 channels of motion data. This can be movements made on any of the controls, for example the filter or the attack time, and this is all over the 16 steps. Really the thing that makes this awesome is the sequencer, which, as well as sequencing stuff, you can kind of use it as an additional envelope generator or LFO to add more layers to your sounds. Let's go through some of the presets. Each preset in turn comes with a pre-programmed sequence. Now let's try making some sounds from scratch. Okay, let's try and do some kind of percussion, drum sounds. Let's try that. And we want to get the... snare drum. Okay, let's try and do a 303 style sound. 303, so. do a classic sinker. Nice. Okay, let's try something else. If, like me, you want to see what's going on under the hood, so to speak, but maybe you just bought one brand new and maybe you're not so sure about taking it apart, well, let's do that, so you don't have to. We've got two circuit boards in here. The lower board looks to be the brains, whereas the top board is populated with all of the pots, switches, LEDs and other controls. Everything is pretty much surface mounted, which is to be expected inside of any modern electronics. The case is mainly plastic, but the pots all look to be good quality with metal shafts, and the top of the case is a sheet of metal or aluminium. On the back is this piece of real wood, oak, I think, which is a nice touch. So I'd say this is actually quite typical of a programmable synth from, say, the 80s in many respects, apart from the obvious things like the modern ARM processor or surface mount components. The analog synthesis and signal part is dealt with what it looks like to be op amps and bespoke ICs. The control board on top, its pots and switches are not directly in circuit with the analog synth circuitry, but rather are being sampled by a microcontroller CPU, and then the value is relayed to the analog circuit for patch recall and so on. But wait! How did I not mention the Korg Monologue was created in collaboration with Richard D. James, aka Aphex Twin? It was his idea to give the Monologue alternative tunings, which is a pretty rare thing for a monosynth to have. We'll also take a look at that. There's also a great article where Richard D. James interviews Tatsuya Takashi. I've no idea how to pronounce his name. But anyway, the Korg engineer who designed the Monologue, which I'll link in the description. I'll also try and find some good bits from it to include here. Mostly they discuss microtunings and how that's implemented on the Monologue, and what that means for musical creativity. In a nutshell, you can alter the pitch in small or large increments of each individual note in the Monologue's range. So you can, for example, change the relationship and frequency of every note on the keyboard. Why? To open up different sonic possibilities and think outside the box of standardized Western harmony. The Monologue comes loaded with some custom preset tunings, and you can also make some of your own.
You are listening to BBC Radio 4, and now on today's most peculiar episode of The Archers, Ambridge receives two guests from the world of electronic music.
I think the Monologue is very nice looking, small, very cute and very capable. At first I thought, oh, it hasn't got this, it hasn't got that, etc, etc. But I very quickly realised you have turned these limitations into advantages, which is really quite something special. I really mean that. The lack of extensive features makes the whole thing much more speedy to work with. That's got to be the best compliment, and it's a way of thinking that runs through all the synths that I've worked on, from the Volkers, Monotrons to Monologue. I think the electronic instrument we've got to the point where software can do most things, but I'm a fan of gear where less is more, where the simplest controls can give you the most creative freedoms. Anyway, I think I mentioned it before, but the drift on the Monologue sounds really nice. It seems to move, but then never go out. Care to explain? Sounds to me like it gets reset synced at some point, but I'm probably wrong. Haven't studied it in depth, just listened. Reminds me a bit of the ARP oscillators, which have really nice driftiness. Prob my faves, smiley face. That's bang on. So same thing in the Monologue and the Volkers too. The oscillators are retuned when they're not being used. I'm super glad you like it though, because this is such a subjective thing. The auto-tuning was done in a way that felt nice to me, so it was really a subjective thing, and you can't present a report to convince others that it was okay. At least now I can say, our DJ said it was alright. Well, my initial impression was that microtuning is a real niche thing that wouldn't be needed for a mass-marketed synth, especially a monophonic one. But if you try shifting the tunings whilst running a sequence, you can hear that it gives another dimension, even if it's subtle. I'm not super sensitive to pitch or anything, but you can still hear it change. To me, it feels like casting light on a rough surface and seeing different patterns as you move the light. So it's really important to have the easy scale editor you can do on the fly. Scala is great, it's super flexible, but it can be daunting to use and you won't get the real-time interaction. So I hope the Monologue gets more people into this stuff. I really like your light analogy, that's great. Yep, on monophonic instruments, what you just described will be more pronounced if you use a delay with plenty of feedback or reverb, so you can hear the differently tuned notes overlapping each other. Use the custom Aphex twin tunings. Right, I keep thinking I've got this video rounded up, but there's still some other stuff to mention, like the MIDI implementation. It's really good on this. All the controls are linked to MIDI CC messages and some hidden stuff, like there's a control message for controlling the pitch of VCO1, a control that's not on the front panel of the synth. The pitch bender can also control numerous other things as well as bending the pitch, filter, VCO shapes, and all sorts of other stuff. There is also software, the Korg Monologue librarian, for loading and saving patches and loading your own microtunings, which you can also create with a third-party software called Scala. There's probably tons of stuff I haven't mentioned, but you know, anyway, it's great. Go and buy one.